Hello everyone. I'm Andrea Graziano. I'm the co-founder of a student association in Bocconi, which is called Bocconi AI and Neuroscience Student Association. We are a student group that tries to help students find research projects in relation to AI. But we also have neuroscience in the name because we believe neuroscience is a field that should be explored to advance AI, current AI systems. That's why we decided to organize this conference in this festival, because we also saw that there are many conferences on AI, but there wasn't much about neuroscience or neuro-inspired AI. So we invited me. I was working with Tristan Stober, who is a postdoc at Ruhr University Bochum, who will give an introduction to the to this topic. He's studying on, he's doing his research around hippocampal theory, potentially to implement his theory on neuromorphic device. I was working with him and I asked him if he could help me organize this session. So we decided to invite Dilip George, who is a researcher at Google DeepMind. He's head of research of Google DeepMind, and he founded this Vicarious AI company, which basically makes robots, that was acquired by Google DeepMind recently. He's working on world models, and he aims to achieve AGI through neuroscience research. And we invited Giacomo Indivari, who's a professor and director of the Department of Neuroinformatics at ETH Zurich and University of Zurich. He's working on neuromorphic hardware, and he aims to work towards neuromorphic cognitive systems, which he will explain more in detail. And Stanislaw Wozniak, who is a researcher at IBM Research in Zurich, and is working on neuromorphic computing algorithms, so biologically inspired algorithms. So they will give you an overview of the NeuroAI field, and I hope it will be interesting. Since they are all researchers or professors, I hope it will not be too difficult for those that maybe are not studying this field, but for sure will be super interesting. So I will leave the floor to Tristan to give an introduction to the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. Just how do I switch the
green one?
The green one?
I think this one.
Okay, yeah. So thanks for introducing me. I'm very honored to stand here and looking forward to this lineup of speakers, which have influenced my thinking a lot. And I'm a neuroscientist working at the intersection with artificial intelligence. And before I go, let's say, I'm standing here to give a bit of a motivational speech, kind of trying to spread this fascination, why it's interesting to consider both AI and neuroscience and hardware development in one topic. But let's start with the following. There's a sci-fi comic series from 1962 called The Jetsons. And maybe you know it. It basically portrays a family living in the 21st century. And it's quite impressive, actually, when you look at what they, by then, predicted, which has been quite recently, actually, become something from our normal day of life. They're using video calls like we use flat screens. They have smartwatches, which actually are a very recent thing. And they have these small robot vacuum cleaners that are also not for so long here in our daily lives. However, not all of their predictions have become true yet. So, for example, there's a very key figure in that series is Rosie. It's a humanoid robot which is very autonomous, so it basically can decide on its own whether it's going to clean or whether it's going to cook. It's super versatile. So in addition to doing all the house chores, it can, for example, teach children. And like also, it has the ability to understand human expressions, human humor, emotions, and can react appropriately on that. And so where's our Rosie today? Why are we not even close to achieving something like that, having these kind of robots? I mean, it's not a lack of economic value in that, right? I mean, having robots that actually can use existing technology, just sit in a car and try for us. I mean, that's obvious that there would be interest in that. But we're not close to even developing something. And what is the problem? And there are several problems, but one key problem is that AI technology still lacks true understanding. So it's not that they don't learn anything. Obviously, it's impressive what current AI technology is able to do, but the type of understanding these algorithms develop is very superficial and very brittle often. And this is an example from a very influential article from 2017 by Brendan Lake, who basically, they used a language model trained on a lot of images and then gave it some let's say, unusual images. And it's obvious that it's getting it super wrong. So, So this here, like, I mean, the scene is probably from some Wild West movie and tracking some person behind a horse. So it's not just a woman riding on a horse on a dirt road, right? But the actual meaning is something very different. Or this plane is definitely not parked at the airport, right? We can easily simulate in our brain what's going to happen if we move forward, if we somehow like play forward, and it's probably not going to end well, I would assume. Or these people are not just a group of people on a beach, right? They are probably fleeing from some nature catastrophe. So the algorithm, you could say, okay, it's 2017, right? We're 7 years forward. Like, there's a lot of progress. There's much better computation power. But this is just scaling up is not the solution in itself. And that's a very nice point often made by Dilip George. And there's a very recent example from Gary Marcus, who's also very influential and somehow like putting his finger in the weaknesses of current AI technology. So if you ask ChatGPT to create a picture of an empty room with absolutely no elephant anywhere, right? It still doesn't get what we mean by that, right? It probably sees, okay, elephant is very important, room is very important, so it seems plausible for this algorithm to create a room with an elephant and doesn't really understand the syntax in the way we would do, right? And that is a key problem we really want to overcome, and how to overcome. And that's actually not an easy thing. So I think there are several things, like very different thoughts and ideas which have to come into this into current technology to move forward. But one key thing is that brains are not trained from scratch, right? They have gone through like millions and billions of years of evolution, and so we are set up with a system that is pre-wired with a like fixed set of brain regions interacting in very distinct ways, and that has a reason, right? So they're optimized to certain tasks. And I mean, this young horse after birth already knows basically how to walk. It's not that it was taught to walk, right? It's somehow like the brain pre-wired itself to be able to do this. And there are other features we are pre-wired to. For example, we are pre-wired to always search for underlying reasons, right? So if someone tells me something and I want to understand why, right? And this understanding, this like building an internal model of the world which is based on causation, that's a key factor in it. Because if you understand what is really the cause behind something, you don't need so many examples. You are much more efficient in learning. And that is something I'm very much looking forward to Dilip's talk, because that is something he has been quite influential in. So trying to suggest how algorithms can discover hidden causes from the world. And that's nicely what also fits to my hippocampal research work, where the hippocampus is a key structure in developing this internal model of the world. And then there's another issue, and that is that so far the hardware we're using for artificial intelligence is super inefficient. I mean, we are impressed with what they do, but I just spoke to Dilip George about it. Even for Google, the hardware demand is really a key bottleneck. So I put in this picture of a candle here because a candle uses roughly 80 watts of energy, like a rough average candle. And our brain runs on 20. So like say the 4 speakers, Andrea and the 3 other main speakers, they're currently using as much energy for their brain as a normal candle does. So it's really nothing compared to like a computer. Like even a standard computer has like 300, 400 watts, right? And that is not even performant on a language model. So to have something like Rosie, which is not automatically running out of battery all the time, we need to really be much more efficient with the hardware resources we're using. And there's where neuromorphic hardware comes into play. And neuromorphic hardware is really, let's say, I expect it to be a key player in moving forward. And that is basically, I'm not going into details here what neuromorphic hardware is, and probably that will come later, but you can imagine that you directly ingrain a neural network onto the hardware level, and that allows much more efficient and much more faster computations. And for example, one of the reasons is that it allows you to mimic what we call action potential in the brain. So basically you have asynchronous computation. It's not like a neural network where for every time step, every clock step, you compute the activity of all neurons at the same time, but you basically integrate information, and only when it reaches a certain threshold, you send an electric pulse further. And that basically means that when there's nothing interesting, right, there's hardly any energy use. And especially that can be super efficient if you combine it with event-driven cameras. And there's also a big, let's say, a big tradition in Zurich where they used and develop event-driven cameras combined with neuromorphic hardware to have sensors which hardly use any energy unless it's necessary. And you may say, okay, that all sounds nice, but how does it relate to my actual research? And Stanislav Wojcik, he's recently co-authored an article where they can show that you can actually also use these spike neural networks with these action potentials, which can be run on neuromorphic hardware, to one-to-one map it to existing neural networks. So the advent of neuromorphic hardware is not very far, and indeed, like many big companies, Intel, IBM, and many others are investing a lot of money to make this hardware quite, let's say, technology ready. But there's still what is still lacking in many regards is the software behind it to make it really easy, and that is coming within the next years. Okay. So I think NeuroAI has a very promising future, and I took this picture from Giacomo's article. It's actually when basically neuroscience, machine learning, and technology interact, they can have very fruitful inspiration for each other. It's not that that should be our aim to rebuild the human brain, but we can take key elements and implement them in machine learning, and we can take technological advances and use them to improve machine learning. So I see a lot of potential in this field. So one thing I didn't mention at the beginning is that the Jetsons actually are portraying not only life in the 21st century, but actually in 2062. So we have some years ahead, and I'm very curious, and I hope I can still live by then, to see whether by then we will have humanoid robots actually doing tasks in the way Rosie is doing. So I'm very much looking forward for the session, and thank you for your attention. Yeah, so it's Dilip, this next speaker.
Hi, everyone. Let me just figure out how this thing works. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so we are at an exciting stage in AI. By the way, my name is Dilip George. I am currently a director of research at Google DeepMind. Before that, I ran a startup company in AI for 12 years doing robotics and AI. And that was recently acquired by Alphabet, and that's why I am at DeepMind. Okay, so this is about the exciting arcs of AI forward. We are at a very exciting time in AI. Looks like lots of things are happening, right? Finally, things are starting to work. Things that we could never imagine before are becoming reality. And there is this feeling that this is it. We have figured it out, and you can just scale it up and get to human-level AI. Multiple companies are talking about it. But there is something to be learned from a similar state of aeronautics back in the 1910s, the early 1900s. You can ask, what happened in aeronautics at that time? And I'm going to just give you a quiz about this, just to ground you. So the first aeroplane by Wright brothers was in 1903. It flew for just 59 seconds or something. The first non-stop transatlantic flight was in 1919. In what year was the Hindenburg accident? So somehow this slide doesn't build it, so but the answer is there. So, but in case you didn't know this, if you're given those two dates, given that first flight was in 1903 and transatlantic flight was in 1919, you would expect airplanes to be the ones used in transatlantic flights in 1930s, correct? But that was not the case. The dominant technology in aeronautics, even until 1930s, was balloons. It was not aeroplanes. And that's because balloons had a very favorable scaling law at that time. All you have to do, if you have a controllability problem, just make it bigger. You have a capacity problem, just make it bigger. And it was just easier to find hot air than figuring out how to make aeroplanes fly long distance carrying more weight. And people would just build on that. And in fact, the history is quite fascinating. When Wright brothers were tinkering with their rudimentary flight, Santos Dumont was giving spectacular demonstrations in Paris of his Santos Dumont 1, 2, it was just like GPT 1, 2, 3, it was called Santos Dumont 1, 2, 3, and there were competitions of flying around the Eiffel Tower, and these were spectacular. These were world attention-grabbing spectacles, whereas Wright brothers were tinkering in their lab during that time without any, and when they flew the first time, people were like, did they actually fly? And there was an article in 1906, 3 years after they flew, in France, there was an article, the title was Flyers or Liars, because nobody could believe that heavier than air is the way to fly, and balloons was the dominant technology, and it was impressive. There was a dining room in Hindenburg. It looks like that. And you can see the flyer from 1936 ad from American Airlines, fly to Olympics in our balloon. And even this Empire State Building, when they were building it, they put a mast on top of it to dock the balloons and just to advertise. So it was not something, a niche thing. It was the dominant theme at that time. But that didn't end well, and that was not the final answer, because heavier than air flight is fundamentally different than just balloons. And although they solve similar problems, if you can fly in the air, carry cargo, go distances, solve the same problems but using very different methods, and they come with very different trade-offs. And I think we are in the similar stage in AI. We have figured out a trick. We have figured out something called transformers, which we can scale very well. And all we need is more data, which in the other time used to be just more hot air. Now we just need more data. And you can collect more and more data and run more and more engineering to make it bigger and bigger, and it will become better and fly a long distance, etc. But fundamentally different from how our brain works. And so those are the two exciting arcs going forward. You can scale up existing models and make them do tasks that we could not do before. And that is exciting. I don't want to dismiss it. I am very excited about it because it's very exciting technology. And the applications are very interesting. But we should not be satisfied with just that, because we also want to build the real airplanes. If the world had only balloons and no airplanes, that would be not an ideal state to be in. It would take a week to fly from Paris to New York. So we should address the fundamental problems that are stopping us from building real human-like intelligence. So those are the two exciting arcs that we need to push forward. And I am planning to be involved in both of them. In the first one, more as a investor and cheerleader and builder of applications. In the second one, as a researcher trying to figure out what are the missing pieces. And here's a list I have on what might be the fundamental missing pieces in today's technology compared to what we actually need to build. And it's about data efficiency and causality, grounding language with mental simulation, learning world models, utilizing emergent insights from the scaled-up models, and also utilizing insights from cognitive and neuroscience. I won't be able to elaborate all of them, but I'll address a few of them today. So this is just to give you intuitions on what these things mean. So let's look at grounding language with mental simulation. Today's the language models are trained mostly just on language tokens. There are multimodal models trained on images and language, but mostly it is just trained on language tokens and very rudimentary connection between just the images and language. But that's not enough, and I want to show you an example. I want to walk you through an example of why it is not enough. So consider this sentence. I'm just telling you a sentence. John pounded a nail on the wall. Very, very simple sentence. And then I'm going to ask you a question. How did you, so I'm going to ask you a question. Was the nail horizontal or vertical? So very simple question, right? John pounded a nail on the wall. Was the nail horizontal or vertical? What you have to imagine is, how did you answer this question? How do you, as a human, answer this question? You actually imagine that scene. You imagine a prototypical John holding maybe a hammer, hitting the thing on the wall, and then you are running a simulation in your brain, and then pulling the answer out from that simulation and saying, okay, horizontal or vertical. If you answered vertical, check with me after the talk. We need to test you. Tristan needs to put you in the scanner. But the point is that you are actually running a mental simulation. And you can ask the question, where does the knowledge for running this mental simulation come from? Did it come from reading about pounding nails on the wall? Or did it come from your experience with things in the world? Most likely, it came from just experience with things in the world. Even if you did not have language, if you had experience in the world of pounding things on the wall, when the situation arises, you would, even if the question is not in language, you would know that, oh, the nail has to be horizontal, and you will need to make actions according to that. So this knowledge that is required for running this mental simulation is acquired through our sensory motor experience in the world, and it is organized in a way such that it can be easily queried from the language side. So this knowledge is not in the language system, it is in the perceptual plus motor system, and it is acquired through sensory motor experience. So the way to think about language and the rest of the brain is that the rest of the brain, the visual cortex, the sensory motor cortex, all of them is where a lot of knowledge corresponding to our physical experience in the world is stored, all the common sense knowledge. And so that's where you are running your mental simulation. And language is just a way to control the mental simulation. So, and to communicate to other people so that you can control simulations in other people's minds. So I am sending a bunch of signals to you through language. What I am trying to do is I am trying to control the mental simulations that you are running in your brain. And that control thing is, oh, this one just gave away everything. Okay, but that control is just a very thin layer on top of this large knowledge base that you have acquired through sensory motor experience. And accessing that knowledge and connecting it to language is what is grounding. And that's a unsolved problem. So yeah, these slides did not build, but I just want to show you that two sentences that look nonsensical without the picture would makes sense given the picture. So if I tell you, go to the door and put the door on the chair, without a associated picture with it, that sentence doesn't make sense. What does it mean, put the door on the chair? But if you are actually building a chair with a door as the backrest, it would make sense. The second one is even funnier. If I just don't look at that picture, and if I tell you the haystack was important because the cloth ripped, that sentence does not make any sense, right? But if you are given that picture, it makes complete sense. If the cloth ripped, then the haystack was important. Not just that. At this point, the properties of the haystack. You know that the haystack cannot be just 5 inches thick. You know that the haystack has to be substantially tall for it to be important. If it was just 5 inches thick, you would be looking for maybe a lake or something where to land. And you would be thinking about, are there crocodiles in the lake? All those things will be coming to your mind if the cloth ripped in this particular situation. So this is why the sentences alone does not make sense. It needs to be situated in the world to make sense. At that situation, situating that sentences in the world is coming through your mental simulations. So this is the, if you want to take one picture out of all of this, language is just a control layer on top, and we are using that to control mental simulations in other people's brain. Mental simulations is where the real reasoning, real intelligence is happening, not in the language. Language can fake it, like balloons can fake flying. The next one I want to talk about is world models. So as I mentioned, all these things require building models of the world in your brain so that that model can be used in the appropriate situation. One example of building a model of the world is building a model of space as we walk around in the environment. So you might have just walked around once to come here, but you have in your brain a rough layout of this environment already formed, and you might be already able to find shortcuts. If somebody blocks this door, you will quickly find another path to get to the place that you want to go to. That was very rapidly acquired, what that model is. And this is an important problem. It's still unsolved in AI, how to build rapid models of space. And when you think about it, it's actually pretty fundamental, because how is space even represented in our brain? Do we come with Euclidean assumptions built in? Do we need to have Euclid's geometry built into our brain, or do we do something else? It's a really fascinating question, and we have I have spent quite some time investigating it, and I think we have found some fundamental things about it. So here is the problem: in a rat's brain or in animal brain, or in a human brain, there is no GPS. When we are walking around, we don't have a GPS. We don't have a location, precisely told to us. Everything that comes to us comes through our vision and audition, etc. Just assume vision. Things just come through vision. It's just that the visual information doesn't tell you where you are in the location. Visual information is just visual information. It doesn't. If you just look at the picture, it doesn't automatically correspond to a location in the world. That location, whatever you are making up in your brain, is something that you are building up, and it comes from the model that you built. So this might become clearer if I give you a simplified version of this picture. Suppose there was a 2D arena like this, and there was a rat running around in the arena, and the rat is just getting local sensations, which is just the color. It can just see the local color. So as it is walking, it's just seeing gray, 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 and green, 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 and so because it's just seeing the local sensations, right? And from that, just the local sensations, it needs to build up a model of that room. And that looks like a pretty hard task, right? Because it's just getting gray, gray, gray for some time, then getting green, green, green for some time. It's not seeing the geometry of the environment, because it's just getting local sensations. That's what actually happens to rats. It's just getting local sensations, but somehow they are able to build a model of the space around them and walk in it. And this is something that we figured out. You can actually do this. We can algorithmically do this from these sensory input, which is heavily aliased because gray appears in so many different locations, you can actually build a map of the world using the methods that we developed. We call it clone-structured causal graphs, and it can recover the layout of the room in a way such that it allows you to plan. And this is without making any Euclidean assumptions about the world. If the world the rat is running in is not Euclidean, it can be running through pipes, for example, which is then not Euclidean. It will find the corresponding geometry automatically from just these sensory observations. And so it can be running on top of a ball or a cube or in tubes. It will recover the geometry, but it is not represented as a Euclidean geometry. It is represented as just a sequence within. And I'm just displaying it as a graph here in the geometric form, just to show that the information is in there, but you are accessing it and dealing with space as just a sequence. So, and that makes sense. When you think about going to the kitchen, you are not ever thinking about going to coordinate X, Y, Z. You are just thinking about, I remember the sensations corresponding to the kitchen, and when I think about the sensations corresponding to the kitchen, I can also recall the path to get there. It's as a sequence that you're thinking about, and I can think about going from one location to the other, but we are not actually thinking XYZ1 versus to XYZ2. We are actually thinking in the sensation from 1 to the sensation from 2, and it is linked together in this sequence model that you built inside. And that really fundamentally changes the way we think about how space is represented in our brain. And this is just examples to show that this works in 3D environments, complicated 3D environments, etc. And so our view, based on this research that will soon be published, is that space and place is a sequence. That's how it is represented in our brain. And space is not directly encoded. It's an inferred concept. We are building this idea of space from sensory inputs, and it's an inferred concept. And this kind of sequential representation gives you a lot more flexibility than traditional Euclidean SLAM-based representations have, which is actually something that prevents us from having Rosie the robot. If you have this rigid existing SLAM mechanisms, it's actually pretty hard to build a robot that can flexibly navigate in the world and in one shot come here and then find the shortcuts to navigate around obstacles, etc. Okay, I will probably skip this one because it's a bit too technical. So this is just explaining the mechanism by which it happens in the system. So let me just skip those. And I just want to conclude with saying there are two exciting arcs of AI going forward. And you can keep this perspective in your mind to make your decisions. You don't have to select one or the other to participate in. You can participate in both. But it might be helpful to know which track you are on so that you don't mix one with the other. Just another framework to keep in your mind to think about the progress in AI. Might or might not be right. We will eventually figure it out. That's the end of my talk, I think. You can get more information. So I have 2 blogs about this. Some of the topics that I talked about. Welcome to the exciting digitals era of AI. That's the idea about how aeronautic situations compares to current situation in AI. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dilip Learning and look at my website for recent publications. And Dilip Learning is just a play on deep learning, of course. Thanks for listening.
I'm Giacomo Individi. I'm going to try to keep the time with the aid of a laptop here. I'm coming from the Institute of Neuroinformatics, and we are both doing experiments in neuroscience. Like it was said, it's really important to look at the real brain to understand how natural intelligence can inspire artificial intelligence, and building hardware, building the technologies that will allow us to implement those radically different models that we've just heard about. The institute is in Zurich, at the University of Zurich and ETH Zurich. It's really an exciting place because in addition to doing, modeling and chips, there are experiments with rats, birds, monkeys, humans, and so on. So I don't need to tell you about how exciting AI is. I just want to remind you that it's even though the original neural network algorithms were being studied in the 80s, and in fact, McCulloch and Pitts neurons were being proposed in the 40s. This is a relatively new era that we are living. We can ask Google to translate our, French to English or any other language. We can search for pictures of cats and so on. Only since a few years. That's because of the advent of data sets. We need a lot of data, like balloons need a lot of hot air. And because technology just became faster and faster. So now we have GPUs, we have faster CPUs, and we can really crunch numbers more quickly. And it is amazing. It's really something that allows us to live better. It's improving society. But there are also problems, mainly related to how we try to interact with the world. We don't have a ROSI yet. So standard conventional AI has some problems and limitations. They are in the domain of energy consumption, which comes from high cost of data movement. If you think of computers, they typically have this von Neumann architecture where the CPU is on one side, memory is on the other. And the CPU, if you think about it, is not really burning a lot of power. It's only a few percentage more than a neuron. It's moving the data back and forth that is burning power. Also, there are other problems about the limitations of the algorithms, not only the hardware, and of how they are close or not close to the way the brain works. What I would like to really highlight is the energy problem. So as it was mentioned before, conventional technologies, they were not designed to run AI. They were designed, by von Neumann and Turing to run general purpose Turing complete algorithms, but not these massively parallel algorithms that we are trying to develop now. And so this is a problem. The conventional processors and computers burn more power than brains. This is a nice plot that IBM made a few years ago showing the power density of the brain and the power density of CPUs. It's just to give you an impression of the difference. The y-axis, which is showing the difference in power, is logarithmic. So it's not, just a factor of 1, 2, 3. It's a factor of 100, 1,000, 1,000,000. So there is a huge difference between the way the brain operates. We heard about the 20 watts, the 80 watts, and the difference between computers operate. And if you see on the x-axis, one of these differences is speed. The trend is to just go faster and faster and faster with CPUs, whereas brains use neurons that have time constants of the order of milliseconds. They don't go at gigahertz, they go at hertz or even fractions of hertz. And so the question is, how can we do fast computation using these very slow computing elements? And so if we look at animal brains, you'll see that one trick is just to use a lot of these slow elements together. By combining slow elements together, it's actually possible to speed up the system response, not the response of the individual elements. So having this massively parallel computation and distributed computation is one key to use low power, but also have speed. Another trick that brains use is what I was telling you before, data movement. So in brains, neurons are densely connected with neurons nearby, but very, very sparsely connected with neurons far away. And the wiring, the length of the distance is really where power is. And so if we want to build lower power computers, we should keep these tricks in mind. We need to connect things locally, and wiring is really, really expensive. As I said, they outperform computing systems in mainly sensory processing tasks. It's not just crunching numbers and doing language, but actually interacting with the world, sensing, receiving inputs, and then maybe also producing outputs. And as I mentioned, they do use slow and variable processing elements. And these computers, these natural computers, can carry out in real time spatio-temporal processing, the type of things we've just seen now with the mice navigating mazes. And typically, the type of hardware that our brains and animals use are optimized for closed-loop interactions with the environment, not, as I said, not for crunching numbers. Also, if you look at the way that algorithms are built, they're built using very, very crude approximations of real neurons. And this is, again, a picture of McCulloch and Pitt's neuron. These algorithms, they are completely independent of the hardware. These neural networks that have these types of simplified neurons, they can run on an Intel processor, on an ARM processor, on a FPGA. The software is completely decoupled from the hardware. Something to keep in mind if we want to reduce power consumption is that we need to do what biology does. In biology, the hardware is the algorithm. There is no distinction between some abstract software description of an algorithm and then the hardware implementation. They are tightly interlinked together. So in biology, neural networks compute by exploiting the dynamics and the natural evolution of physical time through natural evolution of time. That's another important point. In computers, you can run evolutionary algorithms that, in biology take decades or hundreds of or thousands of years. You can run these in computers in milliseconds. And if you're doing protein folding, for example, you can run a CPU algorithm overnight to look at the structure of the protein, and in biology, it would take, milliseconds or even microseconds. So the time is decoupled also from the simulation. In standard computers, biology uses time to do computation, physical time. Now, neuromorphic engineering, neuromorphic computing was mentioned as something that is trying to look at these things and trying to exploit the way the brains work and these principles that I told you to implement hardware technologies that can support artificial or even natural intelligence. The term neuromorphic means many different things depending on who you talk to. So there are different communities that use the same term. It was actually coined by Carver Mead here on the left in the late 80s, early 90s to really refer to electronic systems that could emulate through the physics of electronics biological systems. It was a basic research attempt. It was using analog circuits. I will show you examples. And also digital circuits, because one important factor is that these neurons, they spike. They produce all or none action potentials. And that is also something that is important for computation. This was, the 90s, early 90s, mid 90s. I was actually at Caltech. I was a student of Carver. And Misha Mahowald, who was a biologist, who really started the whole field. Around 2008, HP Labs proposed a new device, a memristive device, that could also be used, in addition to making petabytes in a small volume to replace our USB sticks. It could also be used as a real synapse, because it is a device that has a conductance, like real synapses, and it keeps the conductance in memory. So it memorizes the state of the synapse. So it's called a memristive device. And the physics of these nanoscale devices are very similar to the physics of biological synapses, and that's why they now called it neuromorphic. And then around 2014, we heard about IBM. IBM proposed a simulation engine, a chip that is digital, so it's quite different from the approach of Carver Mead, but this, however, optimized to run spiking neural networks. And that's why it was called neuromorphic. And this is neuromorphic computing. Following this idea, you can implement dedicated chips for spiking neural networks that really use less power than standard GPUs or computers. Now, Intel has been proposing similar things using, again, pure digital approaches. There is the Loihi and Loihi 2. This is very promising. And other companies and startups are really starting to try to make things closer to biology incrementally by making digital chips dedicated for spiking neural network simulations, not emulations. They're really forward-looking breakthrough ideas are always the basic research ones coming from universities, but still there's a lot of progress also from companies and startups. So now the idea here is if you call everything that, you bring everything together and you call this neuromorphic intelligence, this is what we're trying to teach and develop at the Institute of Neuroinformatics and also with colleagues around the world in the whole community. So the idea is really to try to study neuroscience, do a new field that is deeply rooted in neuroscience, exploit the physics of both standard technologies, CMOS transistors, but also memristive devices, these nanoscale memory elements. Combine analog and digital to get the best of both worlds. We shouldn't be fundamentalists in either one camp or the other. And then look at how can we use these technologies to actually solve practical problems, to really help us and society. And I will argue that one of the low-hanging fruits is this edge computing area, domain, this Internet of Things and edge computing. You will see examples. And this is not to scare you, but it's just to show you that by putting together a few transistors, you can actually reproduce the biophysics of cells. So even though one is wetware and the other one is hardware, they're really different. They actually have the same physics. These transistors, these symbols that you see here, are actually conducting electricity if you use them in the right way by diffusion. And diffusion gives you Boltzmann statistics, gives you exponentials, and nature is dominated by exponentials. Diffusion processes are everywhere, including in neurons that allow ions to go from inside the cell to outside the cell when you activate the sodium and potassium pumps to generate action potentials. So this is just a simple circuit that biology students can learn in one semester. And it shows you how, but if you give it an input spike, a pulse, on the bottom left, you get an output current that is exponentially decaying over time. And if you look at the plot, the measurement from the circuit, from a chip, you see these pink and the blue curves. Those are fitted with pure exponentials. So it's true that actually, the theory matches the hardware. And if you look at the inset is actually currents measured from a real synapse, from biology. And I'd like to point out the analogy on the time scale, on the axis, on the x-axis. We can slow down silicon, even though in standard computers they like to go at gigahertz. We can slow them down to go at milliseconds. And we can have very, very small currents. So we can have, with less than 1 volt pulses, we can get picoamps and nanoamps. So we have nanowatts, or picowatts at the level of the single synapse. If you scale things up and you have thousands, you get nanowatts. And then maybe at the level of a whole chip, you get microwatts. This is compared to the GPUs that burn 200 watts, or to cloud servers, Amazon and Google, that are in the order of, hundreds of kilowatts. Now, if you put together these building blocks that I told you can learn in a semester, you can also build more complicated structures. This is an example of the same building blocks. If you notice, you will see the same differential pairs, the same capacitors, but with additional transistors that implement the function of a neuron. So again, you have exponentials, you have slowly decaying exponentials, positive exponentials, and then positive feedback loops that create action potentials, these spikes that are important for communication, but also for computation. And if you look at the power consumption of the neuron here, this is as far as we know from the literature, is the most efficient power, most efficient neuron is 14 picojoules if you make it fire at 30 hertz, which is more or less, when we think hard, it's the rate of activity of the neurons in our brain. So again, it's just to show you that it's possible to build synapses and neurons very much like the biological ones with electronics. And now that we have synapses and neurons, we can create neural networks. So we take these building blocks, we do the layout, which is what you see on the bottom right. It's again something that in digital computers is automatic. In analog circuits, it's still done manually by trained students and experts, also in companies now around the world. But you can then copy-paste these elements and create arrays of neurons, matrices of synapses, and you can create your neural network. The nice thing about analog and digital is that the dynamics are run in analog, in low power, in real time, in physical time, whereas the connectivity between the neurons is done through memory lookup tables in asynchronous digital. So you can program your network, even though it's hardwired for the dynamics, you can actually program it to be a multi-layer network, a convolutional network, a recurrent network, and a mixture of those things. If you look at the features, they are analog sub-threshold circuits that have these exponentials. They are slow, we slow them down. They are massively parallel, but they are noisy. And this is not a bug, it's a feature. If you look at biology, every neuron in our body is different from every other neuron. It's highly heterogeneous. And this variability is exploited by biology to do computation. It's not something that is trying to be suppressed like in standard engineering. And in the same way, we try to look at how does biology do it, and we try to use the same tricks that biology does in our chips to get reliable computation. And those tricks, you can imagine, are learning, feedback, adaptation. So those things are predominant also in the chips, so that we can have brain-like intelligence with reliable and robust computation, even though the circuits there are noisy and slow. So just to summarize, coming to the end, what are these neuromorphic processors? They are something that is very low power, nanowatts, microwatts, it's definitely below milliwatts, sub-milliwatts. They are low latency because they spike. As soon as something happens, within a few nanoseconds, you have an output. So if you need to record with these vision sensors, bullets flying across the room, drops of milk, or have microsecond reaction times, this is the way to go. Drones are using these chips now. More and more conferences are being built up to use these chips for these very low latency tasks. And they are compact. They're really by a few square millimeters, you can get a lot of computation done. But they do, if you want to scale things up, then that actually requires area. That's a problem. They are variable. You cannot do 32-bit floating point precision. You really have to think in a different way. It really needs a breakthrough in doing computation in a different way from standard MATLAB and Python type of compiling. And they're low accuracy. So I would never use this chip to control my airbag or to do my bank account, but I would put it on a Rosie robot, to navigate the room. So it really depends on where you want to use these chips. And that's this point here. They're good for closed-loop sensory motor processing. They're not good for number crunching and high data, batch processing of large sets of data. If you think about it, remember, the power consumption goes in the data movement. So if you have digital data and you have to send it to these chips, even though the chip is 1 nanowatt, you're burning 10 watts to send the data across. So 10.0001 or 10.1 makes no difference. It's really important to have the sensor, the retina, the cochlea, the pressure sensor, the temperature sensor directly connected to these chips to really reduce the power consumption. And again, to do robust and reliable computation, you should use learning in any way you can on multiple time scales, multiple spatial scales. And that's what we try to do. That's sort of the research aspect of this domain. And one of the open challenges really is how to program these chips. There is no compiler. There is no Python, no neural network theory for this. And this is going back to NeuroAI, where we look at computational neuroscientists that try to understand how do brains do it. Brains have the same problem. We have a bunch of neurons of dynamical systems in our brain, and we have to make sense out of it. We have to do finite state machines and algorithms, if then else. And that's being done in this continuous time dynamical state system in a way that is completely different from code that you write on your computer. So that's a challenge, and that's a topic of an area of research, and that's something that we are trying also to achieve. Now, to conclude, we are going in this era where we go from, you probably don't remember yourselves, but we had these computers that would take up a whole room as big as a refrigerator, to even when I was a student, I had a desktop that really occupied half a desk with a huge monitor, to laptops and now cell phones. And the trend is to go into these chiplets where the chips are less and less general purpose, but more and more low power. So we're going in this area where you can put chips in your refrigerator to detect, for example, if the fish has gone bad. You can put them in your shoes to monitor, how well you're walking or jogging, or in various environments to sense the environment. And they cannot do everything, but they can do one thing very well, very much like nature in the animal kingdom. Every insect is different and is specialized to some different topic to survive. So this is the area where we're going, and this is where the neuromorphic technology can have an impact in the short term. In the long term, maybe we will also have natural language models, but at least in the short term, in the next 3, 5, 10 years, I think we can really have an impact in health monitoring, wearable sensor, environmental sensing. Anywhere you need a sensor that is intelligent, this is where these chips can really make a difference. And there are startups. There is a large number of startups coming up in the States, in Europe, in China. One of the ones that came out of our institute is called SynSense, and so I'm also paying tribute to the postdocs that are now trying to make commercial applications out of these ideas. So this is the end. Thank you for your attention, and I guess we are taking questions at the end in the panel session. Thank you.
Thank you to Giacomo and to Dilip. Now there is Stanislaw who can connect online. Okay, perfect. Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you. Thank you also for the pleasure of being able to speak to you. Sorry that I'm remote, but I had some other arrangements. But anyway, my name is Stan Wozniak, and I work at IBM Research Zurich. And I will talk about more of the algorithms behind neuromorphic computing, which recently, to emphasize this difference between the hardware that Professor Indiveri was mentioning, that the key term of neuromorphic computing was primarily associated with the hardware, there is this new term, NeuroAI, appearing very often, and it kind of emphasizes the algorithmic developments. So let's go into the topic, but just before I want to emphasize that I'm from IBM Research. So we are a research division of IBM. We are a different organization. We have offices all around the world, also one in Zurich with a nice view on the Zurich Lake. And our goal is to actually do research into the future of computing and various aspects of it. So there are various interesting topics ranging from quantum computing and also neuromorphic computing. And our particular team is interested in the sustainability aspects of the artificial intelligence. So as you might know, the sizes of the models in the recent years, they have been growing from millions, billions to right now probably trillions of parameters. And this is unsustainable. The amount of energy that is required to train these models or even to do inferencing is becoming out of reach for except from a few big entities in the world. And this is in a big contrast to what was already mentioned before of the brain that can run on 20 watts and is actually more capable than many of these impressive models. In particular, we would like to have more efficient models that would be low power, low latency that anyone could then use. For example, they could be using these distributed sensors. Again, we would like to have our system to be smarter, to have more advanced cognitive features. That goes back to the Dilip George talk. So we would like to have a system that will be able to reason truly and not to fake the reasoning. And finally, we would like to have systems that will be more flexible and have some aspects of online and continual learning, and also in the true sense. So, for example, if you think about the latest developments in large language models, typically, if you want to have them learn something from the context, you apply the techniques of so-called prompt engineering, where you just kind of put some additional context that you don't see as the customer. And the model itself does not really learn, it stays read-only. But the brain, actually, it can evolve. So when we are solving or learning new tasks, our entire brain is capable of learning. And so all of this motivates us to take inspiration from biological systems. And biological systems can give you really many ways of thinking about what can you advance. And these tactics, they could include, for example, event-based communication, so asynchronous, very power efficient. Can be also neural and synaptic dynamics. They have some very interesting computational properties. You can try to model them in computing systems. And also the various aspects of learning. Our team is taking such inspiration from biology, but simultaneously, we also look at the practical applications. We want to apply the rigor of machine learning to validate this, not only to just explore it. Our team has been developing the work in what we have called NeuroAI Toolkit. So this concept is that we take inspiration from various aspects of how the brain works, so the neural dynamics, connectivity, information encoding, learning, etc. And we take pieces of this inspiration, and then we try to develop it into some concrete algorithms and applications that would benefit from it. So throughout this talk, actually, throughout the rest of this talk, I will now go through all of these aspects of this inspiration, and I will give you some background of how the neuroscience does this and how you can translate this to some practical applications in machine learning. These slides might get a little bit technical, but I will just stay on a very Okay. So if we start from neural dynamics, the neurons in the brain, they work using some different principles than what is known in current machine learning. So they operate using spikes, and there are some input spikes coming, and then the neurons, they do some operations, and then they emit also spikes. And these operations, they are also a bit different from the classic deep learning in the sense that there is some internal dynamics involved. They are stateful, they have memory, etc. And the simplest thing that you can do is, for example, you can try to kind of transfer this dynamics into deep learning. And we have demonstrated this in some scientific work. So in principle, we've built something that we call the spiking neural unit, which is an implementation of some of these dynamics in deep learning frameworks. So what are then the consequences? You can then have a look at how deep learning typically solves some particular problems. And the closest formulation to the spiking neural unit is a very popular RNN unit called LSTM. This is something that became very hot quite some time ago already, because this is what enabled, for example, speech recognition in, for example, Android phones when you were talking, etc. These kind of units, they are very good at processing temporal sequences, and they were able to advance this field. And in comparison to them, if you take inspiration from biology, you can see that it's a much more compact, this kind of unit. It requires fewer parameters, and it also has a very interesting properties. It has qualitatively different dynamics. And we did a bunch of small-scale and large-scale examples. Here are, for example, language modeling, music prediction, weather prediction. We constructed some basic networks, and we compared how it works in comparison to these LSTMs. And it seems that just taking the simple inspiration of neural dynamics already can bring you some benefits in terms of accuracy, efficiency, or some noise robustness. Okay, so that was the neural dynamics. Then you can think, okay, you have many of these neurons and how they connect. Again, in classic machine learning, what is typically modeled are connections between axons and dendrites of the following neurons. These are so-called exodendritic synapses. But in biology, there are also various other things that can happen. For example, you can have axonic synapses where the axons might modulate the operation of some other axons of other neurons, or you can have axosomatic synapses where some neurons can actually modulate the states of other neurons. So these are the things that are kind of not there in classic machine learning. Again, you can take the NeuroAI inspired approach, and we implemented this in some simulations, creating some variants of our spiking neural units with these axonic or axosomatic synapses. Okay, so then you can ask, what is now the benefit of this? We took the state-of-the-art RNNTs, or recurrent neural network transducer architecture for speech recognition. And there, for example, it was, as I already mentioned, typically used with LSTMs. We directly replaced this with our neuro-inspired solution, and the result was that the number of multiplications went down by 50%, which is very, very nice, because in principle it also goes down with the inference time goes down by 40%, which are very nice benefits, just, I mean, out of the box, taking existing architecture and replacing some aspects of it. There is still some difference in terms of the word error rate, but actually subjectively these models perform relatively similar. So here I actually have an example. Not sure if you can hear it, but it's not that important to hear it. But you have seen probably that here the transcript appeared a little bit earlier. So this is this benefit that you can really see. So the LSTM model takes a little bit more time. Here we have the time benefit. And also in terms of this word error rates, both models, they tend to make some small mistakes and typos. So for example, here, I was a little bit mean, and I took an example where LSTM made a typo. But in principle, you can see that there are really tangible benefits of taking inspiration from the neuroscience. Okay, then learning, another aspect. Again, you can have a look into how biology does things. So when you try to analyze how learning occurs in the biological neurons, they have these synapses, and these synapses, they have the particular conductance that actually stores some information of the past. And when the synapse operates, it has an associated eligibility trace. This is something where the synapse maintains a trace of its past neural events that were going through this synapse. And then you have some learning signals coming from your system because you got some feedback. And then this is combined. So like kind of this eligibility trace is combined with the learning signal, and there is some adaptation happening. And this is completely different to what, for example, current AI is doing. So in the current AI, if you're running a system, then you would run some computations forward. So you're kind of computing something, and then you get some outputs here. But then, this is called forward pass. But then, to perform the learning, you actually do so-called backpropagation algorithm. And here, actually, for temporal systems, this is backpropagation through time. So you have to, after going forward, you have to kind of pause your system and say, now I want to go backward, and you kind of traverse the entire thing backward, both in space and in time, and you calculate what are your error adjustments. What we have done is we propose, for example, an OSCL algorithm, this online spatial temporal learning, where we shown how you can calculate these eligibility traces, so this small thing. So as you go, you can calculate these eligibility traces, and then when you get some learning signal, then you don't have to go all the way back. So again, biological inspiration translated into concrete algorithms, and there are some interesting relationships with the backpropagation through time, actually. And our algorithm was able to show equivalent performance in some cases. And this is something that, for example, is very important if you want to build chips, because you don't want to have a chip that kind of runs and then Rosie the robot tells you, okay, now I have to stop because I have to kind of process and learn what you told me. So you just want to keep going on. Okay, then another inspiration, information coding. Computers communicate values by sending dense binary streams. So for example, if you want to send number 173 in the binary code, these are the following values, right? But the neurons in the brain, they actually communicate with sparse spikes. And what is very interesting is that there is a concept of time to first spike coding. So when you have a value that is of a very high importance, the brain will send immediately this value very early. So if you assume 8-bit values, the highest value is 255. So for example, you have a value that comes very early. If the value is of a lesser importance, for example, 173, you would just get it a little bit later. And the neurons in the brain, they can actually figure it out from the timing. So what is the difference? Here you used just two pulses of two pulses to transmit two values, whereas here, just to transmit one value, you need multiple pulses. It's much more inefficient. And also the way how the brain does this, it can be potential very high precision, because if you operate, for example, with analog continuous time, then here you can also have some fractions being coded. Whereas if you want to code some fractions here, with binary coding, you have to go to a floating point representation of, I don't know, for example, you could use 32 or 64 bits. So again, it's not really efficient. This kind of concepts of TTFS coding and SNN networks using this kind of coding was present in the neuromorphic community. It was always quite challenging, actually, to train them to operate at high accuracy. And a few months ago, our team also demonstrated that you can just take existing artificial neural networks, for example, VGG16, so like a 16-layer network used for image classification. And what you can do is you can map mathematically the values of these weights into a certain weights and the model of these TTFS neurons. So then I would say we're waiting for the hardware now to actually make use of this energy efficient paradigm, and we can get the accuracy. In the reasoning, another aspect we can take inspiration from. So when humans look, for example, at solving some reasoning riddles, here you have a task that you have to kind of check which one is the other one. The way how this is done by current AI is not really very biologically plausible. You can take inspiration from the temporal dynamics of the brain, and you can also take inspiration from how humans solve these. And it seems that humans, they kind of look at different places of this riddle, and then with their eyes, they kind of do a bunch of comparisons. So we have also, again, taking inspiration and then created a model that has a virtual eye, and this virtual eye is able to kind of to look through these riddles. and then operate with these spiking neurons. And we have demonstrated that it has very interesting properties. So here, if you look at the green curve, this is the size of the model, and here this is the accuracy in the y-axis, and the green curve is kind of a more traditional AI approach. And here, let me just take the best case. So this is like this neuro-inspired approach with saccades and neural dynamics. And you can see that with very, very tiny models, it can get very, very high accuracy. So again, this shows some computational advantages. And we can go on and on this. So we have examples, for example, some optical flow prediction at very high efficiency. We have also examples of spiking neural networks actually performing drone navigation based on images from depth cameras. So you can see benefits over and over. And this actually brings me to the end of my presentation. And just to sum up, the NeuroAI approach takes the inspiration from these aspects of neuroscience to improve AI, and it provides novel, efficient solutions for many applications. And it can bring you, in the long run, it can bring you very big improvements and fulfill all of these goals that have been mentioned already. But also in the short run, we already see improvements, for example, 40% more efficient speech recognition or 10x smaller models for relational reasoning, so solving these intelligence tasks, or 40x smaller model for high accuracy optical flow. So I welcome you also to look at our project website and research. And just final acknowledgement, this wouldn't be possible without other team members and IBM research colleagues. And we also have many collaborators, and we get funding from Swiss National Science Foundation. So thank you very much.
I will start with a quick question for Dilip, which, just to have an overview of the current state of the art of world models, where are we now? What should we expect in terms of, if you have any insight?
Yeah, so the current world models, I don't think there are anything that can be called real world models in the current systems. If you take the large language models and probe them, you can find that there is information in them that might look like world models, but they are very different from the kind of world models that we want to have, because we want the system to be able to manipulate its own world model and do planning and reasoning by manipulating its own world model. There is nothing like that in the existing systems. You have patterns of reasoning that you can exploit with lots of data that has come in, but it's not like our world model. So I would say the world models currently are extremely rudimentary, and when we finally figure them out, they will look very different. That's my bet.
Thank you. Did you say you have a question? Yeah, no, you can go then.
Actually, I have two questions. So the first would be, I don't remember who says that we transition from big computers, mainframes, to smartphones in classical computing. So what about this kind of chips? Where are we located right now? Is it something we are in the middle, or is it going when do you see the transition to mass market?
Yeah, maybe I was the one that was pointing this out, that we are in this transition. They exist already, so you can even find commercial products where you have these chiplets that do sensory processing and have some intelligence. It's a trend, so it started only a few years ago, and you'll see more and more coming. But they both, big companies and small startups already are selling them, from Samsung to Intel to Huawei. So you have them in your house, in your speakers, in your furniture. So they already exist.
And my second question, thank you for the answer. And my second question is about actually I'm a computer scientist, so I learned computer science with the actual chips. What about the future of? Do we need another kind of mix of doctors and computer scientists to move forward in this domain? Or
Yeah, that's a great question, and I thank you for doing it, because it is something that governments, funding agencies, companies realize that we need to create a new generation of researchers and scientists, young generation, so students, not by staying in the classical domains, computer science, engineering, physics, but having interdisciplinary research programs and educational programs. And if you look around the world, there's more and more. So there is mathematics students are learning about biology, biology students are learning about mathematics, computer scientist students are learning about neuroscience. This event here is a demonstration that there is this interest and this goal from even universities to really go in this direction. And there are a few programs in the world that have started this a few years ago, at Caltech, at RIKEN, in Japan, in Switzerland, and others in Paris, others around the world. But more and more universities are embracing this interdisciplinary approach.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just had one quick question. Do you think we need to understand first how the human spatial recognition mechanism works in order to construct robots or machines capable of autonomously navigating space?
You don't need to. You can engineer quite a lot of the way, because in fact sometimes trying to do it the human way might be slower or might not be the most expedient path. So if you want to build self-driving cars now, you want to have probably LiDAR as a sensor, and you probably want to build very detailed maps of the world, and that might be, maps as in you scan the streets and build very detailed 3D models inside your system. That might be the most practical way to go right now. So that's always a thing in technology, right? If you want to build something now, in few years, you have to make a bet based on what is the existing things that you can utilize to get there. Whereas if you are looking for something longer term, then there is a different. So it's a practical technology question, and each one has to be made based on its own merits. There is no one general answer. So I wouldn't say you have to understand. And second part of that question is that I think we will understand it won't be like, oh, we will first understand the brain and then we will build the system. So both will go hand in hand. It will be, and if we can't build anything, we can't even claim that we have understood the thing. So I would think that we will push understanding of the brain and the ability to build systems like that at the same time.
Thank you very much.
So you guys talked a lot about the use of neuroscience to inspire the creation of AI-based systems. But you didn't talk anything about the complexity that is the brain and the complexity that is neuronal connectivity and the lack of understanding that we actually have that works and the distributedness that is inside of the brain. And then if you're to try and take that and mirror it on technology, you would end up with an insanely complex system that you don't really understand how it works to get its outputs. So how does the field see this going forward to overcome this problem?
So I go by this common cortical circuit hypothesis, right? And if that hypothesis is wrong, then yeah, we are off. So the common cortical circuit hypothesis is that the cortex, the mammalian cortex, which came recently in evolution, has a mostly uniform structure everywhere. That the visual processing, the auditory processing, language processing, cognition, all are using roughly the same circuits and mechanisms. So that means you can find common principles connecting them, rather than thinking vision is something so distinct from audition is something distinct from language. They're all roughly the same, and there are common principles underlying them, and that's why the circuits, the cortical circuits look the same. Of course, there are variations, adaptations corresponding to each modality, but there are some common underlying principles. So in my thinking, if this hypothesis is true, it is easier to reverse engineer a human neocortex compared to reverse engineering an old animal. Like, if you want to reverse engineering a lizard, that might be harder because it's like reverse engineering a custom-made chip, which has many idiosyncratic circuits compared to reverse engineering a microprocessor, which is a more generic architecture. So, so that's a hypothesis that's saying that old brain animals have very idiosyncratic circuits, and neocortex is much more general and more easily reverse engineerable. It's a hypothesis. We'll have to see.
I agree completely. In fact, neuroscientists disagree on many things, but if there's one thing they agree on is that there is this canonical microcircuit. In fact, the founders of the Institute of Neuroinformatics, Rodney Douglas and Kevin Martin, came from Oxford and now are in Zurich. They are among the ones that really propose this canonical microcircuit idea. And it's true that it is not too difficult to reverse engineer these principles, and it's amazing. As soon as nature found the trick that the neocortex works, it expanded it much more quickly than the whole other rest of the evolutionary scale. It's like an op-amp. It's being used everywhere, from somatosensory to olfaction to audition. And in terms of building hardware, what we can do is we can, instead of trying to build a whole brain, we can try to build small pieces of it that are well understood. For example, the retina is one of the most well understood pieces of the brain. The retina is part of the brain. And now we have these dynamic vision sensors that are really reproducing accurately many properties of the retina, and now are being used in real practical applications. Similarly, for audition, we are now building, my colleagues, Shichi Liu and others around the world, are building silicon cochleas, both for machines, but also for cochlear implants for children that have defects, and so on. And so now we are slowly going into the neocortex and starting to build small pieces of artificial neocortex that can do, for example, finite state machines. Very simple programs, if you like. But at least we ride the wave of neuroscience understanding, which is the bottleneck. We can do many chips. We can put as many transistors as we want on chips. The bottleneck is really the understanding. But neuroscience has been making steady progress, maybe even more quickly in the last years, and we are just riding the wave. So it's true, it is a bottleneck, but it's promising. I think it's a really good time to look into these things because of both the convergence of technology and the understanding in neuroscience.
I can add one more thing. The evidence from AI is that this hypothesis might be true because at least we are using common circuits, common architectures across vision, audition, and language, which earlier were thought to be so different, but now at least in deep learning has shown that we can use the same thing for all of them. So that is an additional evidence in support of this.
Can also add one thing. So even going beyond the cortex, other brain structures are also highly evolutionarily conserved, right? And I mean, it's daunting if you look at one brain, if you were able to measure all the connections, but always consider that it goes through a strong bottleneck, that it has to be encoded in DNA, right? And then evolves. So it's the information and the building principles must be much less complex than the brain when it's developed. So.
We still have 1 minute. Yeah, go.
So Giacomo, I was wondering, I keep reading about like neuromorphic hardware or like spiking networks implemented in optical devices, right? How do you think will that impact the neuromorphic community? Like, do we think that electric components will remain the core, or will it move to a different substrate?
Again, I think using the principles of the brain with whatever technology is at hand is really something to try to experiment with. Optics has many advantages, for example, for communication and transmitting lots of signals without having to use wires. So there is a lot of potential in using the principles of neuroscience to take advantage of the physics of the optic systems. As I said, it's a long road to get to a large, complex system that can do maybe sensory motor processing and natural language. That's why I think the low-hanging fruits are in these CMOS sensory or sensory motor chips, but large corporations are also investigating in quantum and optics and using the principles of the brain. So I think it's really something to look forward to. It's not my field of expertise, but I'm very hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you, Giacomo Indiveri. Thank you to Philippe George and to Tristan Sober and to Stanislaw Wozniak, who could not join, but thank you anyways for the great presentation online. Yeah, and thank you for listening. So you're free.